Good evening and welcome to Bedtime Sleep Story. Tonight, let us push away from the shore together and drift slowly out onto the widest, oldest road in the world, the open ocean. This is a story of wooden ships and patient sailors, of star maps and trade winds, of harbors glowing with lanterns and long, quiet watches beneath unfamiliar skies. We will follow the first navigators who read the waves like a language, ride with great fleets across warm seas, drift past icebergs glowing in the polar twilight, and sink gently down to where strange lights drift through the eternal dark of the deep. There's nothing here to hurry for. Every voyage we will speak of has long since come home or found its rest, and the sea itself keeps no schedule at all. If these quiet journeys help you rest, a gentle like or a follow helps other tired travelers find this harbor too. But for now, there's nothing you need to do. Loosen your shoulders, let your eyes grow heavy, and let the day slip from your hands like a mooring rope. Let your breathing find the slow rhythm of water against a hull. And as the tide turns softly beneath us, let us begin. Human beings were crossing open ocean long before history was written. Tens of thousands of years ago, the ancestors of Australia's first peoples crossed wide stretches of open water on simple rafts and canoes, long before any pyramid or city existed. There were no charts, no compasses, and no written word at all, only courage, observation, and a knowledge of wind and current passed from one generation to the next. They watched birds fly toward unseen land, read the shapes of clouds that gather over islands, and trusted the sea roads they could not see. Their crossings were among the first great expeditions in human history, made with tools no more complicated than wood, fiber, and patience. It is a humbling and gentle thought that the ocean has been carrying curious people safely across its back since before memory itself, and that exploration is among the oldest of all human habits. The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles of open Pacific using only nature itself. Among all the seafaring peoples of history, few have ever matched the navigators of the Pacific Islands. In double-hulled canoes laden with families, plants, and animals, they crossed distances that still astonish modern sailors, finding tiny islands scattered across the largest ocean on Earth. They steered by the rising and setting points of stars, by the feel of swells bending around distant land, by the flight paths of birds at dawn and dusk, and by the color of light on the underside of clouds. Master navigators held entire living maps in memory, learned over years of training. No instruments, no metal, no writing, and yet they settled an area larger than all of Europe. Their knowledge was a quiet symphony of attention. The sea itself read like a familiar book, page by patient page. Ancient Egyptian ships were sailing to distant lands more than 4,000 years ago. The Egyptians, so often pictured among their pyramids, were also among the earliest organized ocean voyagers. Their ships of cedar and papyrus traveled the Red Sea on royal trading expeditions to a place they called Punt, a land of incense, gold, and exotic creatures, somewhere to the south. Carvings show their vessels returning heavy, with myrrh trees and pots, baboons climbing the rigging, and sailors hauling lines beneath wide sails. One queen, Hatshepsut, sent a famous fleet whose story was carved across the walls of her temple, where it can still be read today. These were careful, state-planned voyages, with scribes recording every jar and bundle. Long before lighthouses or compasses, the ships of the pharaohs were already coming home on the evening tide, their holds fragrant with the resins of a faraway shore. Phoenician sailors may have circled all of Africa 2,500 years ago. The Phoenicians were the great mariners of the ancient Mediterranean, traders whose purple-dyed cloth and cedar ships were known on every coast. An old account tells that a pharaoh once hired Phoenician crews to sail all the way around Africa, a journey that took them 3 years. Each autumn, the story says, they would land, plant grain, wait for the harvest, and then sail on. Strangest of all, they reported that as they rounded the continent's southern tip, the midday sun stood on the wrong side of the sky to their north. That odd detail, dismissed by some ancient readers, is exactly what would happen south of the equator, and it makes the tale ring true to many today. If so, they had quietly completed one of the greatest voyages of antiquity, 2,000 years before it was done again. Viking ships reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. From their fjords in Scandinavia, the Norse sailed astonishing distances in open wooden ships, settling Iceland, then Greenland, and finally touching the shores of North America around the year 1000. At a place called L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of their camp, turf walls, and iron rivets, quietly confirming the old sagas. The Norse called the new land Vinland, and though their settlements there did not last, the voyages themselves were extraordinary. Small crews steering by sun, stars, and seabirds across some of the roughest water on Earth. They carried no charts, only sailing directions remembered and retold, landmark by landmark, in the long, fire-lit evenings of the North. Long before the great age of exploration, the Nars of the Vikings had already stitched a thin, brave thread across the North Atlantic. Chinese treasure fleets dwarfed anything Europe would build for centuries. In the early 1400s, the Ming Emperor sent Admiral Zheng He westward with fleets of a scale the world had never seen. Hundreds of ships sailed together, crewed by tens of thousands, led by towering treasure ships that may have been several times the length of Columbus's largest vessel. They carried silk, porcelain, and silver to the ports of Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa, and returned with spices, jewels, ambassadors, and even a giraffe for the imperial court. These were voyages of display and diplomacy as much as trade, vast floating cities moving with the monsoon. Then, after 7 great expeditions, China turned inward, and the fleets sailed no more. The great ships rotted quietly at their moorings, leaving behind one of history's most remarkable what-ifs, and the memory of an ocean briefly ruled by silk sails. For most of history, sailors could find their latitude, but not their longitude. A navigator far from land could always work out how far north or south he was, by measuring the height of the sun at noon or the North Star at night. But knowing how far east or west he had traveled was another matter entirely, for that required knowing the exact time back home, and no clock could keep time on a rolling ship. So for centuries, captains sailed by dead reckoning, a careful running guess of speed, course, and current, marked daily on the chart. Small errors quietly grew into large ones, and whole fleets sometimes found coastlines days before they expected them. The longitude problem became the greatest scientific puzzle of the seafaring age, with kingdoms offering fortunes for a solution. Until it came, every long voyage carried a margin of beautiful, dangerous uncertainty, and landfall was always a small act of faith. A self-taught carpenter solved the longitude problem with a clock. The answer, when it finally came, was not from the great observatories, but from the workshop of an English carpenter's son named John Harrison. He spent his whole life building clocks that could keep nearly perfect time at sea, despite damp, cold, heat, and the endless motion of the waves. His masterpiece, a compact marine timekeeper, finished in his old age, lost only seconds on a voyage across the Atlantic. With such a clock, a captain could compare local noon to the time back home and know at last exactly how far around the world he had come. Harrison fought for decades to have his achievement recognized, a patient man against a skeptical establishment. His gleaming timekeepers still tick in a London museum today, small brass hearts that once taught the entire ocean to be measured, and brought countless sailors safely home. Captain Cook's voyages mapped more of the Pacific than anyone before him. In the late 1700s, James Cook, a farm laborer's son risen through the ranks, led three great expeditions that transformed the map of the world. He charted New Zealand and the east coast of Australia, crossed the Antarctic Circle among the ice, and traced islands across the Pacific from Tahiti to Hawaii. His ships carried astronomers, botanists, and artists, turning each voyage into a floating academy. Cook was also famous for keeping his crews alive, insisting on fresh food and clean quarters, at a time when long voyages routinely killed half the men aboard. The maps he drew were so accurate that some were still consulted in the 20th century. Quiet, exacting, and endlessly curious, he filled in more of the blue blank spaces of the globe than any navigator before him, one careful sounding at a time. Scurvy killed more sailors than storms, battles, and shipwrecks combined. The great hidden enemy of long voyages was not the sea itself, but a simple missing vitamin. After months without fresh fruit or vegetables, sailors' gums bled, old wounds reopened, and strength drained away. Scurvy emptied whole ships in the age of sail, claiming perhaps 2 million lives over the centuries, more than every cannonball and hurricane together. The cure, when found, was almost absurdly gentle. Citrus juice, fresh greens, the simple kindness of vitamin C. A Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind ran one of history's first clinical trials aboard a ship, giving 6 sailors different remedies and watching the orange eaters recover. It took the Navy decades to listen. But when lemon juice finally entered the ration, the ocean grew vastly safer. One of the greatest victories in the history of exploration was won not with weapons, but with fruit. Magellan's expedition was the first to sail all the way around the world. In 1519, 5 ships left Spain under Ferdinand Magellan to find a western route to the Spice Islands. 3 years later, a single battered vessel, the Victoria, limped home with just 18 exhausted men, having done something no one had ever done: circled the entire planet. Magellan himself did not live to see it, falling in the Philippines midway through the voyage. The survivors had crossed 2 oceans, found the storm-racked strait at South America's tip that still bears their captain's name, and starved through the unimaginable emptiness of the Pacific, which proved far wider than any map had dared suggest. They returned with a cargo of cloves that paid for the whole expedition, and with something greater, the first true measure of the world's size, written in the wake of one small, stubborn ship. The Pacific Ocean is so vast that all the continents could fit inside it. When Magellan's crew first entered it, they found a calm so wide it nearly killed them, for they had provisioned for weeks and sailed for months. The Pacific covers about a third of the entire planet, more than all the dry land on Earth combined. From space, there's an angle at which the world appears almost entirely blue. One great ocean with a few distant rims of coast. Its name means peaceful, given by Magellan for the gentle weather he happened to meet, though it can rage with the worst storms on Earth. Across its expanse lie tens of thousands of islands, scattered like seeds. Every expedition that crossed it, from Polynesian canoes to steamships, was crossing the largest single feature of our world, a blue country, bigger than all the others put together, breathing slowly under the moon. Sailors crossing the equator have held playful ceremonies for centuries. When a ship crossed the line for the first time, those aboard who had never done so were initiated in a boisterous ritual older than most navies. A sailor dressed as King Neptune, draped in seaweed and crowned with a trident, would hold court on deck, and the newcomers, called pollywogs, endured dunkings, mock trials, and gentle humiliations before being welcomed as trusty shellbacks, true children of the sea. The tradition, in friendlier form, continues on naval ships, research vessels, and sailing yachts to this day, complete with elaborate certificates. It was and remains a way of marking the invisible, a line that exists only on charts, celebrated with laughter in the middle of the empty ocean. Even on the longest, hardest voyages, sailors found room for theater, costume, and play, a little carnival floating on the deep. The chronometer, sextant, and compass formed the navigator's quiet trinity. For roughly 2 centuries, the tools of ocean navigation changed remarkably little. The magnetic compass, in its softly lit binnacle, gave the course. The sextant, a beautiful arc of brass and mirrors, caught the sun or a star and measured its height above the horizon. And the chronometer, wound with ceremony each day and trusted like a member of the crew, kept the time of home. With these three, a skilled navigator could fix a ship's position anywhere on Earth to within a few miles, after weeks out of sight of land. There was a daily rhythm to it: the morning sights, the noon sun, the careful arithmetic in pencil, the small penciled cross on the chart. It was mathematics performed on a moving deck in all weathers, an act of daily devotion that quietly carried the world's commerce home. The Challenger expedition invented the science of the deep sea. In 1872, a British warship called HMS Challenger set out with her guns removed and her decks fitted with laboratories on a voyage of pure curiosity. For 3.5 years, she wandered the world's oceans, lowering weighted lines into the abyss, dredging the bottom, and bottling seawater from every depth. Her crew measured the deepest place then known, sounding nearly the full depth of what is now called the Challenger Deep. They discovered thousands of new species, mapped the ocean floor's hidden mountains and plains, and filled 50 volumes with findings that founded the science of oceanography. Much of the work was monotonous, hauling miles of rope by hand, day after day, yet it changed our picture of the planet forever. The deep sea, once imagined as a lifeless void, turned out to be the largest living space on Earth. Sailing ships once raced each other across the world to bring tea home first. In the mid-1800s, the fastest sailing ships ever built, the clippers, flew across the oceans with cargoes of tea from China, their holds sealed and their captains driven by a single purpose: arrive first. The new season's tea fetched premium prices in London, and the great clipper races became national sporting events, with newspapers tracking ships across 15,000 miles of ocean. The most famous race saw rivals docking within hours of each other after 100 days at sea. These ships, like the surviving Cutty Sark, were the perfection of the age of sail, clouds of canvas above knife-thin hulls, sometimes outrunning the early steamships. Their era was brief and beautiful, ended by the opening of a canal and the steady advance of steam, but for a few decades, the fastest things on Earth were powered entirely by wind. A ship's speed was once measured with a rope, a log, and an hourglass. The old way of telling how fast a ship moved was charmingly simple. Sailors tossed a wooden board, the log, over the stern, attached to a line knotted at regular intervals. As the ship sailed away from the floating log, the line ran out through a sailor's fingers, and he counted how many knots passed in the time a small sand glass took to empty. The number of knots was the ship's speed, and to this day, ships and aircraft still measure their pace in knots, a unit named for actual knots in an actual rope. The results were entered in the logbook, which is why ships' journals, and eventually all kinds of records, came to be called logs. Inside our modern words hides this gentle picture: a sailor counting knots slipping through his hand, while sand ran softly through a glass. Lighthouses once formed a chain of human kindness around every coast. Before satellites and radar, the only welcome a returning expedition could count on was light. Oil lamps and polished lenses turning patiently on headlands and reefs, each with its own rhythm of flashes that sailors knew by heart. Keepers and their families lived in profound isolation on wave-swept rocks and lonely capes, trimming wicks and winding clockwork through the night, whatever the weather. The great Fresnel lenses they tended, beautiful as jewels, could throw a single lamp's glow 20 miles to sea. Every flash said the same simple things. Here's the coast. Here's danger. Here is the way home. Most lighthouses are automated now, but thousands still stand, and their lights still sweep the dark. Few human inventions have ever been so purely generous, burning all night, every night, for the benefit of strangers passing in ships. The crew of a polar expedition survived nearly 2 years after their ship was crushed. In 1915, the explorer Ernest Shackleton watched the ice of the Weddell Sea slowly crush his ship Endurance, leaving 28 men stranded on floating ice at the bottom of the world. What followed became legend, not for conquest, but for survival. Months camped on drifting floes, a desperate boat journey to a barren island, and then Shackleton's almost unbelievable open boat voyage, 800 miles across the worst seas on Earth, to fetch help from a whaling station. He then crossed that island's uncharted mountains on foot to reach it. Every single man survived. Shackleton never reached his pole, yet his name became a byword for leadership and hope against impossible odds. The wreck of Endurance was found in 2022, resting upright and remarkably preserved in the dark, 3,000 meters down. Charles Darwin's voyage on the Beagle quietly changed how we see all life. In 1831, a young naturalist joined a small survey ship for what stretched into 5 years around the world. While the Beagle charted coastlines, Darwin wandered ashore, collecting beetles, fossils, and finches, filling notebooks with patient observations. He saw earthquake-lifted shorelines in Chile, strange giant tortoises in the Galapagos, and coral islands rising from deep water. And slowly, gently, the pieces began to arrange themselves in his mind. The theory he later published would transform biology forever, but it began as a sea voyage. Seasickness, cramped quarters, and endless curiosity. Darwin himself never sailed again, content to think for decades about what those 5 years had shown him. It is a quiet reminder that some expeditions discover not new lands, but new ways of seeing, and that the greatest distances are sometimes crossed inside a single human mind. Ships once carried their own time in a guarded wooden box. Aboard a long voyage, the chronometer was treated almost like a sacred object. It rested on gimbals in a padded case. often in the captain's own cabin, and was wound at the same hour every day, usually by one trusted officer, with a second man watching as witness. No one else might touch it. Larger ships carried two or three, comparing them daily against each other, like a small committee of timekeepers. The reason for all this ceremony was simple. That ticking box was the ship's only link to the time back home, and from it came every calculation of longitude. A dropped chronometer could mean a lost ship. So sailors guarded time itself, carrying it gently across oceans in mahogany and brass, a small, steady heartbeat of home swinging quietly through every storm. The doldrums could trap sailing ships in glassy calm for weeks. Near the equator lies a belt where the trade winds of the two hemispheres meet and cancel, leaving long stretches of windless, breathless sea. Sailing ships entering this zone, called the doldrums, sometimes sat motionless for weeks, sails hanging slack, the ocean smooth as oil, the heat pressing down like a blanket. Crews whistled superstitiously for wind, towed the ship with rowboats, and watched fresh water run low. The word doldrums entered everyday language as a name for any period of stagnation and low spirits. Yet, the same calms had their beauty. Nights of perfect stillness, the entire sky doubled in the black mirror of the sea, dolphins leaving trails of glowing light. The ocean, which can be all fury, can also be utterly, completely still, and old sailors knew both faces of it well. Trade winds were so reliable that whole economies were built upon them. The great winds of the world blow in steady, predictable belts, the trade sweeping toward the equator, the westerlies rolling through the middle latitudes. Sailing captains learned to ride them like rivers, dropping south to catch the trades across the Atlantic, then climbing north to ride the westerlies home. Whole trade routes and the fortunes of empires followed these invisible highways, and a voyage's length could be predicted almost to the week because the winds kept their ancient schedule. The Spanish galleons, the tea clippers, and the spice fleets all turned with this great wheel of air. Even today, sailors crossing oceans for pleasure follow the same paths, and the winds still arrive on time, as they have for thousands of years, patient and punctual, the oldest reliable transportation system on Earth. The monsoon lets sailors ride the seasons themselves across the Indian Ocean. Long before Europe's age of exploration, the Indian Ocean was already a busy sea of commerce, thanks to a wind that changes direction with the calendar. For half the year, the monsoon blows steadily one way, from Africa toward India. For the other half, it reverses. Arab, Indian, Persian, and East African sailors learned this rhythm centuries ago, sailing out with one season and home with the next, as dependably as catching a scheduled ferry. Ports like Zanzibar, Calicut, and Muscat grew rich on this gentle pendulum of wind, their markets filling and emptying with the seasons. Dhows with triangular sails still make such passages today. It was exploration in its most patient form, not fighting the ocean, but listening to it and letting the planet's own breathing carry you there and back again. A Moroccan traveler named Ibn Battuta journeyed farther than almost anyone of his age. In the 1300s, a young scholar left Tangier intending a pilgrimage to Mecca and did not truly stop traveling for nearly 30 years. By ship and caravan, he wandered through East Africa's port cities, around Arabia, down the Swahili coast, across to India, and on to Southeast Asia and China, covering perhaps 75,000 miles in an age of sail and sandal. Much of that distance passed over water, on dhows riding the monsoon between the great harbors of the medieval world. At journey's end, he dictated his memories, a vast book of wonders, courts and storms, spice ports, and shipwrecks. His account remains one of our richest windows into the connected ocean world of his century, proof that the sea lanes of the East were crowded with travelers long before European sails appeared on them. Sailors believed in sea serpents, and the ocean still keeps a few surprises. For centuries, mariners returned with tales of monsters, serpents rising from the swell, krakens dragging ships down, mermaids singing on the rocks. Map makers drew writhing beasts in the blank corners of their charts. Most of it was imagination, loneliness, and the strange tricks of light and water. And yet, the deep eventually yielded real giants. The giant squid, with eyes the size of dinner plates, unphotographed alive in its own world until our own century. The oarfish, a silver ribbon of a creature 10 meters long, likely father of 1,000 serpent tails. Whales whose songs travel across entire ocean basins. The lesson of the monsters is gentle. The old sailors were wrong in their details, but right in their instinct. The ocean truly was, and still is, home to creatures stranger than their dreams. A message in a bottle once drifted for more than a century. Sailors and scientists have long tossed sealed bottles into the sea, some carrying farewells, some carrying questions. Printed cards asking the finder to report where the ocean had carried them. These drift bottles became a quiet tool of early oceanography, slowly sketching the great currents. One German research bottle, thrown into the North Sea in 1904, was found on an Australian-German expedition's old route. More than 108 years later, its message still legible inside. Other bottles have crossed entire oceans to be found by children on distant beaches, sparking friendships between strangers half a world apart. There is something tender in the whole practice, a person standing at a rail, trusting a few words to the largest thing on earth, and the ocean in its own unhurried time delivering. The ocean's currents form one vast, slow river that circles the globe. Beneath the waves runs a circulation grander than any river on land. Warm surface streams like the Gulf Stream, carrying tropical heat toward the poles, cold, deep currents sliding back along the bottom. Oceanographers call the whole system the Great Conveyor, a single connected flow that takes roughly 1,000 years to complete one circuit of the planet. A drop of water sinking in the North Atlantic may travel the deep for centuries before rising again in the Pacific. Expeditions map these rivers in the sea slowly, with drift bottles, drogues, and patient measurement, and found that they shape the climate of whole continents, warming northern Europe and feeding the world's richest fishing grounds. The sea that looks so formless from a beach is in fact all motion and order, a clockwork of currents turning slowly beneath every voyage ever made. Whaling voyages once lasted 3 or 4 years at a stretch. From ports like Nantucket and New Bedford, whaling ships sailed on some of the longest expeditions of the age of sail, hunting across the Pacific for years before their holds filled with oil. Life aboard was a strange mixture of monotony and peril. Weeks of empty horizon broken by the sudden cry from the masthead. Between hunts, sailors carved scrimshaw. Intricate pictures, etched into bone and tooth, made thousands of letters home that might arrive after the writer, and gathered news from passing ships and mid-ocean visits called gams. Wives sometimes sailed with captains, raising children who learned to walk on a moving deck. It was a hard industry the world has thankfully outgrown, but those long voyages knitted the first truly global web of ocean knowledge, and their logbooks now help scientists reconstruct the winds and whales of 2 centuries past. The first accurate world maps were stitched together from sailors' charts. Every great voyage came home with more than cargo. It carried soundings, coastline sketches, compass bearings, and notes on currents, all of which flowed into the slowly improving map of the world. Chart makers in Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, and London gathered these fragments like collectors, locking the best charts away as state secrets, for an accurate map was worth a fleet. Generation by generation, the coastlines on paper crept closer to the coastlines of the earth, bays deepened, phantom islands appeared and were quietly erased, and the world took its familiar shape. A modern map of the oceans is, in a sense, the combined logbook of every navigator, whoever took a careful bearing. Thousands of voyages compressed into a single drawing, the sea's memory written down one sounding at a time, until the planet finally recognized itself. Longitude 0 runs through a hilltop observatory in Greenwich. Every chart on Earth measures east and west from a single imaginary line, the prime meridian, which passes through the old Royal Observatory above the Thames in London. It is there because, for 2 centuries, British naval almanacs, the careful star table sailors used worldwide, were calculated from Greenwich. And so, the world's navigators slowly adopted its meridian as their common zero. In 1884, an international conference made it official. From that line, too, comes Greenwich Mean Time, the ancestor of the time signals, by which the whole planet still sets its clocks. Visitors today stand astride a brass strip in the courtyard, 1 foot in each hemisphere, smiling for photographs. It is a gentle monument to a practical idea, that a world of travelers needs one shared starting point, and that even the turning Earth can be given a page number. The Northwest Passage defeated explorers for 4 centuries. The dream was irresistible. A sea route over the top of North America, a shortcut between Europe and Asia, threading the islands of the Arctic. Expedition after expedition sailed into the maze of ice and channels, and for 400 years the passage refused them all, most famously the Franklin expedition, which vanished entire in the 1840s. The riddle was finally solved gently, not by a fleet, but by a small herring boat. Roald Amundsen, with 6 companions, spent 3 patient years working through, wintering with Inuit communities, and learning from them how to live with the ice rather than against it. His little Joa slipped into the Pacific in 1906. The lesson he carried away, that the Arctic rewards humility and local wisdom over force, would later carry him calmly and efficiently all the way to the South Pole. Inuit knowledge guided the explorers who listened. The peoples of the Arctic had been living, traveling, and navigating in the polar world for thousands of years before European ships arrived, reading snowdrifts shaped by prevailing winds, the underside glow of clouds over open water, and the behavior of animals. Explorers who treated them as teachers, like Amundsen, learned to drive dogs, wear fur instead of wool, build snow shelters, and hunt seal. And such expeditions tended to come home. Those who clung to brass buttons and tinned food too often did not. Inuit guides and hunters were quiet partners in many famous journeys, their names recorded faintly or not at all, though the routes and survival skills were theirs. It is a truth worth saying softly. A great deal of polar exploration was less discovery than introduction, the newcomers being shown patiently a world others already knew by heart. The race to the South Pole ended in triumph and tragedy together. In 1911, 2 expeditions converged on the last great unclaimed point on Earth. Amundsen's Norwegian party, traveling light with dog teams and skis, reached the South Pole in December and returned as smoothly as a training exercise. Robert Falcon Scott's British team arrived a month later, man-hauling their sledges to find the Norwegian flag already flying, and then perished one by one on the long march back, the last of them just 11 miles from a supply depot. Scott's final letters, found with his body, were so moving that defeat became a kind of victory in memory. The two stories have traveled together ever since. One a masterclass in preparation, the other a hymn to endurance. The pole itself, a featureless plain of ice, holds both flags in its silence, and the research station there today bears both men's names. Ernest Shackleton placed an advertisement legend says read, "Safe return doubtful." The famous notice, supposedly posted before his Antarctic expedition, promised small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, and honor and recognition in case of success. Historians have never found the original, and it is probably a later invention, yet it survives because it tells a truth about the age. Thousands of men really did volunteer for exactly such terms. Polar expeditions were oversubscribed despite frostbite and scurvy because the chance to step off the map outweighed every hardship. Crews were chosen as much for temperament as for skill. Shackleton famously prized optimists, men who could sing, joke, and keep a mess tent warm in spirit through an Antarctic winter. The advertisement may be myth, but the men were real, and the sea ice they camped on remembers a kind of courage that asks very little in return. The deepest place in the ocean has been visited fewer times than the moon, was once true. The Challenger Deep, in the Mariana Trench, plunges nearly 11 kilometers down, deep enough to swallow Everest with kilometers to spare. In 1960, Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh rowed the bathyscaphe Trieste to the bottom, a descent of 5 hours into absolute dark, where they were astonished to see a flatfish stir from the sediment, life thriving under pressure that would crush a tank. For half a century afterward, no human returned, and it was said more people had walked on the moon than touched the ocean's deepest floor. In recent years, new submersibles have finally made repeat dives, mapping and sampling the trench. The deep remains the least known country on our planet. We have better maps of Mars than of our own seafloor, and the ocean keeps most of its rooms still unlit. Hydrothermal vents revealed life that does not need the sun. In 1977, scientists in the submersible Alvin, exploring a volcanic ridge near the Galapagos, found something no biology textbook allowed. The deep seafloor crowded with life, giant tube worms, white crabs, fields of clams, all flourishing in total darkness around chimneys of hot, mineral-rich water. Instead of sunlight, the food chain ran on chemistry, bacteria feeding on the vent fluids, and everything else feeding on them. It was one of the great biological discoveries of the century, an entire way of being alive that no one had imagined, found by accident on a geology dive. Some scientists now think such vents may be where life on Earth first kindled, and similar oases may exist under the ice moons of distant planets. The expedition went looking for warm water and came home having widened the definition of life itself. Sonar let ships finally see the landscape beneath them. For all of history, the seafloor was known only by the plumb of a weighted line, one lonely depth at a time. Then, in the 20th century, ships learned to sing to the bottom and listen for the echo. Sonar pulses, timed precisely, drew profiles of the deep as vessels steamed along, and the blank floor of the ocean resolved into drowned mountain ranges, vast plains and trenches deeper than any canyon on land. The mid-ocean ridge, a single volcanic mountain chain, winding through every ocean like the seam on a baseball, turned out to be the longest range on Earth, almost entirely unseen. Mapping it helped prove that the seafloor spreads and the continents drift. Every modern chart of the abyss began with that simple idea: a ship calling gently downward through miles of dark water, and the floor of the world answering. Murray Tharp drew the map that revealed the ocean floor's secret. In the 1950s, women were not allowed aboard many research ships, so Marie Tharp worked ashore, turning endless rolls of sonar soundings collected by her colleague Bruce Heezen into hand-drawn maps of the Atlantic floor. As she inked the profiles, she noticed a deep notch running down the center of the mid-ocean ridge, a rift valley, exactly where the Earth might be pulling apart. Her observation, dismissed at first as girl talk, became a cornerstone of plate tectonics, one of the great scientific revolutions of the century. The beautiful painted ocean floor maps she and Heezen later published gave humanity its first real look at the hidden two-thirds of the planet's surface. She spent her career at a drafting table, yet few explorers with ships and flags ever discovered more, line by careful line. Ocean expeditions carried artists before they carried cameras. Every well-equipped voyage of the age of sail brought someone who could draw: officers trained in watercolor, naturalists with sketchbooks, sometimes a professional artist among the crew. Their work was not decoration but data, the only way to bring home the curve of an unknown coastline, the rigging of a foreign ship, the colors of a fish that would fade within an hour of being caught. Expedition artists painted icebergs and atolls, first meetings and farewell feasts, working with frozen fingers and salt-spotted paper. Many of their watercolors survive in archives, still bright, and through them we see the great voyages exactly as their crews did, in soft pigment rather than pixels. When photography finally came aboard, something practical was gained and something gentle was lost. No camera ever chose, as a tired artist must, only what mattered most to remember. The Gulf Stream was charted with the help of whalers and a curious postmaster. Benjamin Franklin, serving as colonial postmaster, wondered why mail ships from England took weeks longer westbound than merchant vessels did. His cousin, a Nantucket whaling captain, knew the answer at once. There is a great warm river in the sea, and the whalers ride it east, but cross out of it heading west, while stubborn mail captains sailed straight against it. Together they produced one of the first charts of the Gulf Stream, the mighty current that carries tropical warmth up the American coast and across to Europe. Franklin even measured its temperature on his own Atlantic crossings, dipping a thermometer over the side several times a day. It was oceanography before the word existed, born of practical curiosity and a sailor's folk knowledge. And the chart it produced still looks remarkably like the satellite images of today. Matthew Maury turned old logbooks into the first wind and current charts of the world. A 19th century American naval officer, grounded from sea duty by an injury, found himself in charge of a depot full of dusty ship's logs going back generations. Where others saw clutter, Maury saw data. He set clerks to extracting every recorded wind, current, and temperature, and distilled them into charts showing the best sailing routes for each season. Captains who followed his tracks cut weeks from their passages, and in return, he asked only that they send him their own observations, enlisting the world's merchant fleet as a volunteer research network. His sailing directions made voyages faster and safer across the globe, and he is remembered as a father of oceanography. It was a gentle kind of genius. No new ship, no new instrument, just the patient realization that the answers were already written down, waiting to be gathered. Weather ships once kept lonely station in mid-ocean for science and safety. For much of the 20th century, small vessels were assigned to hold fixed positions far out in the Atlantic and Pacific, riding the swells for weeks at a time, doing nothing but observing, launching weather balloons, measuring waves, reporting conditions by radio for the forecasts that ships and aircraft depended on. Crews called it the most boring heroism afloat, month after month, anchored to a set of coordinates in empty water, painting, fishing, and studying between observations. More than once, a weather ship became the nearest rescuer when an airliner or yacht came to grief in mid-ocean. Satellites eventually took over their work, and the last weather ship left her station in 2010. They are mostly forgotten now, those patient little ships, but every modern forecast carries a trace of their long, uneventful, quietly useful vigils. The ocean is still mostly unexplored, and that is today's invitation. After all the voyages, all the charts, all the cables and satellites, the Great Blue remains the least visited part of our world. Only about a quarter of the seafloor has been mapped in fine detail, and scientists estimate that most species living in the ocean have never been seen or named. New expeditions sail every year. Robotic gliders ride the currents for months on the energy of a light bulb. Autonomous ships map bridges no eye has seen, and biologists lower cameras into midnight waters, where every second creature is new to science. The age of exploration did not end. It simply moved offshore and grew quieter. Somewhere tonight, a research vessel is holding station over an unnamed seamount, instruments drifting down through the dark, and the oldest human story, setting out to see what is there, is still being written. Containers and satellites finished what the chronometers began. The romance of navigation has changed shape, but the achievement underneath it is astonishing. A modern ship fixes its position by satellite to within a few meters, anywhere on Earth, in any weather, every second. Voyages that once took Magellan 3 years are scheduled to the hour. The great container ships, largest moving objects ever built, follow the old trade wind routes their square-rigged ancestors pioneered, carrying in a single hull more cargo than entire historic fleets. On the bridge, the chart table still holds paper charts and a sextant, kept ready by law and tradition. A quiet salute to the centuries of bottle messages, knotted ropes, and brass clocks that taught us where we are. Every package that crosses an ocean tonight rides on 5,000 years of accumulated seamanship. All of it, in the end, the long, patient gift of sailors. Ship's biscuits could outlast the voyages they fed. The bread of the age of sail was hardtack, a biscuit baked so dry and dense it could survive years in a barrel. Sailors joked that it was best eaten in the dark and softened it in coffee, soup, or seawater stew. Some biscuits genuinely outlived their ships. Museums today display hardtack well over a century old, still intact, still recognizably biscuit. Alongside it went salted beef and pork from casks, dried peas, and, on lucky days, fresh fish. Cooking happened in a single iron galley stove, doused in rough weather. So many meals were cold ones, eaten braced against the roll. It was monotonous fare, and sailors dreamed in detail about shore food. Yet that humble biscuit, twice baked and patient, fed every great expedition of the sailing centuries, the quiet fuel of discovery, crumb by stubborn crumb. Fresh water was the true treasure carried aboard. A sailing ship could carry months of food, but water was the harder problem. Casks turned green and foul, rationing began early, and every island stop was first of all a search for a stream. Crews caught rain and spread sails during squalls, and a good downpour was celebrated like a payday. Some captains, Cook among them, experimented with early distillation, boiling seawater and condensing the steam, though it was slow, fuel-hungry work. The daily water ration shaped shipboard life as much as wind did, and the cry of land was often, in the sailors' minds, the promise of a river. Modern ships make fresh water effortlessly from the sea, but the old logbooks remember when every cup was counted, and when the sweetest luxury an ocean expedition could imagine was simply drinking deeply without anyone watching the cask. Hammocks were a sailor's bed, and the sea rocked them to sleep. Below decks, sailors slept in canvas hammocks slung from the beams, each man allotted a few inches of swinging room, packed close as pages in a book. The hammock was a small genius of an invention, borrowed from the peoples of the Caribbean. While the ship rolled, the hammock hung level, so the sleepers swayed gently instead of being tumbled from a bunk. Each morning, they were lashed tight and stowed in nets along the rails. Watches changed every 4 hours, so the spaces below were never fully asleep and never fully awake. A warm, dim world of creaking wood and breathing men. It is a soothing picture to drift on. Hundreds of sailors rocking softly in the dark, the whole crew swaying together with the sea, sleeping their way across an ocean toward the morning watch. The ship's bell divided the ocean day into gentle music. Time aboard was kept in watches of 4 hours, and within each watch, the bell sounded every half hour. 1 bell, 2 bells, up to 8, when the watch changed and the cycle began again. A sailor waking in the dark didn't need a clock. The bells told him where he stood in the day, and the phrase 8 bells came to mean the end of a watch, and, in time, the end of a sailor's life as well. The bell was also the ship's voice in fog, rung steadily to warn others groping through the gray. Cast in bronze and engraved with the ship's name, bells often outlive their vessels, recovered from wrecks as their most personal relic. For centuries, every expedition moved to the same soft schedule, the hours rung out in pairs across the empty water. Cats sailed on nearly every expedition in history. Wherever ships carried grain, biscuit, and rope, rats followed. And so cats became official members of nearly every crew that ever sailed. They earned their passage honestly, patrolling the hold, and earned their place in the crew's heart for free. Sailors considered a contented cat good luck and fed it better than themselves. Some cats logged extraordinary careers, surviving sinkings, transferring between ships, and seeing more ocean than most admirals. Expedition photographs from the Polar Age regularly include a cat tucked into a sailor's jacket, and ship's logs record their adventures alongside weather and position. Dogs, goats, monkeys, and parrots sailed too, but the cat was the constant. It is a comfortable truth to fall asleep on. Across 5 centuries of exploration, through storm and calm and mutiny and triumph, somewhere below decks, a cat was almost always sleeping in a coil of rope. Figureheads gave every ship a face to meet the sea. At the bow of a sailing ship, just beneath the bowsprit, rode a carved figure, a goddess, a lion, a swan, a hero, leaning into the waves with painted eyes fixed on the horizon. Figureheads were the soul of the ship made visible, carved by specialist artists and treated by crews with real affection. Sailors believed the figure watched over the vessel, and a ship that lost hers to a storm was thought to sail unlucky until she was replaced. Many survive in museums now. Weathered women and worn lions gazing across quiet halls instead of oceans. Paint softened by salt and years. They are strangely moving to stand before, faces that actually crossed the great waters, that met every wave first, leading whole crews through darkness and weather toward landfalls the carvers at home would never see. Sea shanties turned heavy work into shared rhythm. Hauling an anchor or hoisting a topsail took dozens of men pulling in perfect unison, and the tool that synchronized them was song. A shanty man called the verses, often improvised and frequently cheeky, and the crew thundered the chorus, every pull landing on the beat. Different jobs had different songs, long, slow shanties for the capstan's steady walk, sharp call and response for hand-over-hand hauling. The words wandered the world with the ships, gathering verses in every port, in every language. Officers tolerated even the rude verses, because a singing crew was an efficient crew. Steam silenced the working songs, but the melodies survived ashore, and people still gather to sing them today. Inside every shanty is the actual tempo of the age of sail, the exact heartbeat at which human muscle, multiplied by music, once moved the commerce of the world. Tattoos were a sailor's diary written on skin. Deep water sailors collected tattoos the way travelers now collect stamps in a passport, and each design meant something earned. A swallow marked 5,000 miles at sea, a turtle crossing the equator, a fully rigged ship rounding Cape Horn, the hardest passage of all. An anchor said Atlantic crossing, a dragon said service in Asian waters. Many were charms as well. A pig and a rooster inked on the feet were believed to keep a sailor from drowning. Port tattoo artists knew the whole vocabulary, and an old salt's arms could be read like a logbook, voyage by voyage. The custom spread from the sea into the wider world, but its grammar was born on expeditions, a way for men with few possessions to carry their entire history with them, indelibly, wherever the next ship was bound. Crossing Cape Horn was the sailor's badge of honor. At the bottom of South America, where the Andes finally sink into the sea, the Atlantic and Pacific meet in a corridor of near permanent gale. Rounding the Horn against the westerlies could take weeks of brutal tacking through enormous seas, ice, and screaming wind, and it broke ships and hearts alike. Sailors who had done it earned the right to wear a gold hoop earring and, by tradition, to put one foot on the table at dinner. Those who rounded it 3 times could supposedly spit to windward, a joke about defying the sea itself. Clipper captains drove their crews through it because the route was fast, until the Panama Canal offered mercy. Today, rounding the Horn remains the summit of ambition for ocean sailors, and yachts still pause there, engines quiet, to honor every canvas-driven soul who fought past that gray rock. The Panama Canal let ships sail through a continent. For 4 centuries, every voyage between the Atlantic and Pacific meant the long, dangerous detour around Cape Horn, or unloading everything to cross by land. Then, in 1914, after one of the greatest engineering struggles in history, the Panama Canal opened. 50 miles of locks and lakes, lifting entire ships 85 feet over the spine of the Americas and setting them gently down in the other ocean. The voyage from New York to San Francisco shrank by 8,000 miles. Ships today still ride the same century-old locks, tugged by electric locomotives called mules, rising and falling in chambers of green water between the jungle hills. From a deck mid-transit, the whole improbable idea becomes calmly obvious. Humanity wanted the oceans joined, and so, with patience and shovels and locked gates the size of buildings, they were. The Suez Canal stitched east and west together at sea. In 1869, after 10 years of digging, the desert between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea finally opened, and ships could pass from Europe to Asia without rounding all of Africa. Voyages to India shortened by weeks. The slow sailing routes around the Cape of Good Hope, which had defined 3 centuries of expedition life, began to fade. The canal favored steamships over sail, since the Red Sea's winds were unreliable, and so it quietly ended the great age of canvas. It remains one of the busiest water corridors on Earth, a procession of vessels gliding single file between the dunes, watched by herons. Seen from the deck, it is a surreal and peaceful sight. Enormous ships apparently sailing through sand, the wakes of the world's commerce lapping gently against a desert. Steamships freed expeditions from the mercy of the wind. When engines first went to sea, they were doubted, dirty, and dearly fueled, and early steamers kept full sailing rigs just in case. But a steamship could hold a course straight into the wind's eye, keep a schedule, and push through calms that becalmed clippers for weeks. Ocean travel changed from an art of patience into a matter of timetables. Mail, passengers, and science began to move on appointed days. For explorers, steam opened the rivers and the ice. Vessels could now nose up the Congo and the Yangtze, or butt through polar pack, where sails were helpless. Coal smoke replaced bird song at the masthead, and something wild went out of the ocean roads. But the engines beat on like patient iron hearts, and the world grew suddenly, permanently smaller, one funnel at a time. Crossing the Atlantic became a race for a ribbon called the Blue Riband. Through the golden age of ocean liners, the great shipping lines competed for the fastest Atlantic crossing, an unofficial trophy known as the Blue Riband. Each new holder, Mauritania, Bremen, Normandy, Queen Mary, was a national event, celebrated with headlines and fireworks. The record fell decade by decade from 9 days toward 3.5. Liners became the grandest moving objects of their era, floating palaces with ballrooms and orchestras, their funnels painted in company colors known worldwide. Emigrants in steerage and millionaires above all rode the same hulls toward new lives. The last record holder, the United States, still exists, and the riband she won has never been seriously contested since, for the jets took the passengers and left the sea, at last, to cargo, cruises, and the long memory of speed. The Titanic's loss made the whole ocean safer. The most famous shipwreck in history carried, within its sorrow, a quiet legacy of reform. After the great liner struck ice and sank in 1912, with lifeboats for barely half her people, the seafaring nations gathered and wrote the first international convention for safety of life at sea. Lifeboat places for every soul aboard became law. Wireless sets were to be manned around the clock, and an international ice patrol was founded to track icebergs on the Atlantic routes, a service that continues to this day, its aircraft still dropping memorial wreaths each April over the wreck site. Generations of sailors and passengers since have crossed in greater safety because of lessons written that cold night. It is the ocean's sternest pattern, softened by time. The sea teaches expensively, and humanity, grieving, slowly and faithfully learns. Radio ended the deepest loneliness of the sea. For all of maritime history, a ship over the horizon was a world unto itself. No message could reach her, and her fate for months was simply unknown. Then, at the start of the 20th century, Marconi's wireless crossed the water on invisible waves, and ships could suddenly speak to shore, to each other, across hundreds of miles of empty sea. Operators in their cramped radio shacks tapped Morse through the static, passing news, gossip, chess moves, and, when needed, the new distress call that every operator dropped everything to answer. Rescues that would once have been impossible became commonplace. Families learned that their sailors were safe mid-ocean. Something ancient quietly ended. The absolute silence of a ship at sea, and something gentler began. No expedition, however far it sailed, ever needed to be entirely alone again. Ocean liners once carried the whole world's mail. Before aircraft, every letter between continents traveled by sea, and the fastest liners bore the proud prefix RMS, Royal Mail Ship. Mailrooms below decks sorted thousands of sacks mid-crossing, so that letters could be ready the moment lines went ashore. A liner's arrival set the rhythm of business on both sides of the ocean. Love letters, contracts, newspapers, remittances home. All of it moved at the speed of the best ship on the route, and a storm in the Atlantic could delay the news of the world by days. Ships' post offices even had their own postmarks, collected eagerly today. It lends the old expeditions a tender cargo to imagine. Alongside the coal and the passengers, every great hull that crossed the water was carrying tens of thousands of voices. Paper conversations rocking patiently in the dark between continents. Lightships anchored where lighthouses could not stand. Some of the most dangerous shoals lie far from any rock that could carry a tower. So for 2 centuries, ships themselves became the lighthouses. Painted bright red with their station's name in huge white letters, lightships anchored directly over the peril, burning their lights and sounding their horns through every storm, unable by duty to run for shelter precisely when every other vessel was fleeing past them. Crews served weeks at a stretch in the world's most stationary sea duty, fishing, painting, and enduring the eternal role. To pass one at night, its lantern swaying steadily above the black water, was to see faithfulness made visible. Buoys and automation have retired them all now, and the survivors rest in harbors as museums, sturdy little ships whose whole career was simply to stay put and shine. The sea has its own language of lights at night. After dark, every vessel on the ocean tells its story in colored light. Red on the port side, green to starboard, white astern, so that any sailor seeing a distant pattern can read at a glance which way a stranger is heading and who must give way. Fishing boats, tugs with tows, ships not under command, each adds its own coded lamps. A vocabulary written into international law and memorized by every watchkeeper on earth. From a dark bridge, the night sea becomes a quiet conversation, a green light sliding safely past, a pair of reds saying keep clear, a far masthead light lifting and dipping on the swell. It is one of civilization's gentlest agreements, this luminous grammar, all the world's mariners speaking the same few words of light so that everyone finally gets home. Every ship still carries paper charts and someone who can use them. For all the satellites and glowing screens of a modern bridge, international rules and old wisdom keep the ancient skills alive. Officers still learn celestial navigation, taking the sun with a sextant and reducing the sight with tables, because electronics fail and the sky does not. Chart tables still hold paper, pencils, dividers, and the soft eraser smudges of corrected positions. Naval academies, after briefly dropping celestial navigation, quietly brought it back. There is prudence in this, and also reverence. The knowledge that carried Cook and Magellan is considered too precious and too occasionally necessary to let die. Somewhere on the ocean tonight, a young officer is standing on a wing of a bridge, sextant raised to a star her great-great-grandfather's generation also steered by, keeping a 5,000-year-old conversation between sailors and the sky politely alive. The age of sail survives in tall ships that train young sailors still. The great square riggers did not entirely vanish. Dozens survive and new ones are still launched, serving as sail training ships for navies and youth programs around the world. Aboard them, teenagers who have never left a city learn to lay aloft on a swaying yard, haul lines in a watch team, and steer by compass through a night at sea. Every few years, the tall ships gather for races and festivals, and whole harbors fill with masts again, as if a century had politely stepped aside. Sailors say the experience changes young people, the way the old expeditions changed their crews. The same weather, the same teamwork, the same enormous patience. The ships are kept not from nostalgia alone, but because the ocean still teaches a curriculum, confidence, humility, and watchfulness that nothing ashore has ever quite replaced. The ocean floor is mapped tonight by robots that sail themselves. The newest expeditions often carry no crew at all. Autonomous surface vessels, looking like orange surfboards with wings, ride the waves for months, powered by sun and wind, measuring and mapping as they go. Undersea gliders porpoise slowly through the depths on buoyancy alone, surfacing now and then to phone their data home by satellite. Whole fleets of drifting floats, thousands of them, rise and sink through the world's oceans on schedule, taking the planet's temperature. Scientists ashore in their offices follow it all on screens, an age of exploration in slippers. Yet the spirit is unchanged. Instruments wander where no one has measured before and send back word of what they find. The ships have learned to sail themselves, but the questions they carry are the same ones the first canoes took over the horizon. Whales were the first long-range ocean navigators, and we follow them still. Long before any human raft, whales were crossing entire oceans on regular routes, from polar feeding grounds to tropical nurseries and back, navigating by senses we still only partly understand. Gray whales swim some of the longest migrations of any mammal, and humpback songs travel for miles through the deep sound channels of the sea. Early expeditions followed whales to find rich waters. Today, expeditions follow them out of care, tagging and tracking to protect their ancient roads from ship traffic and noise. Sometimes a research vessel will idle, engines hushed, while a whale the size of the ship itself passes alongside, one traveler regarding another. It is a humbling companionship. On every ocean road humans have ever pioneered, something vast and warm-blooded had already been commuting peacefully for 1 million years. Pacific navigators are reviving wayfinding, and canoes again cross oceans by starlight. In the 1970s, a Polynesian voyaging society in Hawaii built hokulea, a traditional double-hulled canoe, to prove the old crossings were no accident. A master navigator from a tiny Micronesian island, Maupeailug, agreed to teach the nearly lost art, steering to Tahiti without chart or compass, by stars, swells, and birds. The voyage electrified the Pacific, and a renaissance began. New canoes, new navigators, trained in the old memory arts, children learning star paths their great-grandparents had been discouraged from speaking of. Hokulea has since sailed around the entire world, welcomed in port after port like a returning ancestor. It is among the gentlest victories in the history of exploration. A seafaring knowledge once nearly extinguished, sailing again, taught by elders to teenagers. The oldest navigation school on Earth back in session. The Atlantic has been crossed by rowboat, by balloon, and by teenagers. Once the great oceans were mapped, people began crossing them simply to see if they could in every conceivable craft. The Atlantic has been rowed solo, first by fishermen in 1896 and many times since, each rower spending months alone with blisters and stars. It has been crossed by hot air balloon, by amphibious jeep, by sailboards, and by sailors as young as 16 and older than 80. Ocean rowing has become an organized sport with races and records, its participants reporting the same discoveries as the old explorers: enormous skies, deep fear, deeper calm, and the kindness of dolphins at dawn. The age of firsts never really ends, it just grows more personal. The horizon that called Magellan calls weekend rowers now, and the ocean, with grave courtesy, treats their small boats exactly as seriously. Every color of the sea has an explanation, and sailors learn them all. Deep open ocean is a blue, so dark it approaches violet, because clear water swallows every other color of light. Coastal seas turn green with microscopic plant life, brown near great river mouths, milky turquoise over coral sand. Polar waters can glow jade beneath ice. Old navigators read these colors like road signs. Polynesians watched for the green flash of lagoon light on cloud bases. Captains nearing soundings noted the water paling over the continental shelf. The Red Sea, the Black Sea, the White Sea, the Yellow Sea. All are named for moods of water and weather. Modern satellites now read ocean color from orbit to measure the sea's invisible meadows. But the essential skill is ancient and soothing: to look long and carefully at water and understand what the color is quietly saying. The deep scattering layer fooled sonar into finding a phantom seafloor. When early sonar operators pinged the deep, they often found a bottom far too shallow, a ghost floor that rose toward the surface every night and sank every dawn. The mystery resolved into one of the ocean's great spectacles: a living layer, kilometers wide, of small fish, squid, and shrimp-like creatures so dense it reflected sound, migrating up each night to feed in the safe dark and retreating each day into the depths. It is the largest animal migration on Earth, performed vertically every single night across every ocean. Lanternfish, glittering with their own lights, make up much of it. Among the most numerous vertebrates on the planet, almost never seen by people. Somewhere out beyond the shelf tonight, the whole mid-ocean is quietly rising. Billions of small travelers commuting toward the moon. Bioluminescence turns ship wakes into rivers of light. On warm, dark nights, the sea itself can ignite. Every wave crest flickering blue-green, dolphins drawing glowing torpedo trails, the wake streaming behind a ship like poured starlight. The light comes from countless microscopic organisms that flash when disturbed, a chemical sparkle perfected ages before fireflies. Sailors of every century have leaned on the rail to watch it, and expedition journals are full of attempts to describe the indescribable: seas of liquid fire, breaking waves like green lightning. In some bays, the effect is so strong that fish dart about like comets, and a swimmer trails constellations from their fingertips. Science explains the chemistry, but explanation subtracts nothing. It remains the ocean's most generous night performance, ancient, silent, and free, light made by the sea itself, escorting every traveler who crosses after dark. St. Elmo's fire-crowned masts with harmless blue flame. In charged storm air, the tips of masts and yardarms sometimes glow with a soft blue or violet light, hissing faintly, a phenomenon sailors named for their protector saint and took as a sign the worst was passing. Columbus's crews saw it. Magellan's chronicler described it dancing on the rigging like candles. Darwin watched it from the Beagle on a night when the sea itself seemed alight. It is electricity made visible, the same gentle discharge that hums from pointed things under thunderclouds and perfectly harmless. But picture it as the old crews did. Far from land, wind screaming, and suddenly the whole dark web of mast and rope outlined in steady, unburning fire, as if the ship had been quietly blessed. Few sights at sea were ever so frightening and so comforting at once. Rogue waves were sailors' tales, until science finally caught one. For centuries, survivors spoke of lone waves like walls, twice the height of anything around them, appearing from nowhere in mid-ocean. And for centuries, scientists politely doubted, since the standard mathematics made such giants nearly impossible. Then, on New Year's Day, 1995, instruments on a North Sea platform recorded a wave of 26 meters, passing in a sea of 12, and the legend became measurement. Satellites soon showed rogue waves are rare but real, born where currents focus swells or storms overlap. Ships are now designed with them in mind, and the old accounts have been quietly reread with new respect. It is a recurring courtesy the ocean pays to its sailors. Their strangest stories, given enough time, keep turning out to be true, and the sea remains larger than the equations. The Atlantic seafloor holds a telegraph cable laid by Victorians. In 1858, after repeated heartbreaks, two ships met in mid-Atlantic, spliced their cables, and sailed apart toward Ireland and Newfoundland, paying out an iron and copper thread along the abyssal plains. The first transatlantic telegraph messages crawled through it at a few words per minute, and crowds celebrated in the streets. When that cable failed, the engineers, led by the patient merchant Cyrus Field, simply tried again until one held. The expedition ships that laid it, including the colossal Great Eastern, charted the deep Atlantic as they went, discovering by accident the mid-ocean plateau they named Telegraph. Today, fiber optic cables along the same routes carry almost all the world's internet beneath the feet of every wave. Whenever a message crosses the ocean in an instant tonight, it travels a road first paved, yard by careful yard, from the deck of a rolling Victorian ship. Ocean wandering brought us the words we still travel by. The sea salted every language it touched. We feel adrift when undecided, take a different tack when changing approach, are taken aback by surprise, just as a square rigger is when wind strikes the front of her sails. We learn the ropes, weather a storm, find safe harbor, end up high and dry. A loose cannon was a real and dangerous thing on a gun deck. So was the bitter end, the last link of anchor chain. Even posh and groggy carry sea stories in their bones. Most of us speak sailor every day without noticing. The vocabulary of expeditions dissolved into ordinary life. Languages remember what mattered to the people who spoke them, and for the better part of human history, much of what mattered moved by water and was worried over and named by crews far from home. Naming rights at sea created the map's gentlest poetry. Explorers named what they found for sweethearts, saints' days, sponsors, moods, and accidents, and the charts kept everything. The Pacific is scattered with Deception Islands, Hope Bays, and Capes Farewell. One Antarctic inlet is called Paradise Harbor because whalers found it calm. Cook named the Society Islands diplomatically. Blywater in Fiji remembers an open boat escape, and the Marquesas carry a Spanish noblewoman's title across a Polynesian sea. Mount Disappointment, Cape Catastrophe, Point Lookout. Every name is a tiny logbook entry, a feeling preserved at the exact coordinates where someone felt it. Modern atlas is read in places like an anthology of sailors' diaries. Whatever else expeditions carried home, they left language behind them on the water, and the world's coastlines are still wearing, quite comfortably, the emotions of people 3 centuries asleep. The sextant's whole art was bringing a star down to the sea. To take a sight, a navigator held the sextant to his eye, viewing the horizon through clear glass, while a system of mirrors brought the reflected sun or star sliding down until it seemed to rest exactly on the sea's edge. Then he read the angle from the brass arc, noted the chronometer's second, and went below to work the mathematics. Done well, it fixed the ship within a mile or two after weeks at sea. There was craft in every step, rocking the instrument gently to find the true vertical, shading dark glasses against the sun, catching twilight when stars and horizon are visible together. Navigators grew attached to their own sextants, kept in velvet-lined boxes like instruments of music. It was, in its way, exactly that. An instrument for playing the sky, tuned to bring heaven and ocean briefly, usefully together. Ships' logs preserved the ocean's weather for centuries, and scientists read them still. Every day at sea, in fair weather and foul, officers recorded wind, sky, temperature, and sea state in the ship's log. Millions of observations accumulating in archives long after the voyages were forgotten. Today, climate scientists treasure these brittle pages. They are the only weather records that exist for most of the historical ocean. Volunteers around the world help transcribe old naval and whaling logs, recovering the winds of 1790 and the ice edges of 1850, extending our picture of the planet's moods back through centuries. An officer dutifully noting a gale in 1812 could never have imagined who would finally read his entry, or why. It is a quiet afterlife for all those careful pens. The world's old expeditions, long retired, still reporting for duty in the science of the future. The ocean owns the planet's quietest places, and expeditions have begun to listen. Lower a hydrophone into the deep, and a hidden world speaks. Whale song rolling for hundreds of miles through natural sound channels. The crackle of snapping shrimp like static. The groan and ping of ice. The distant heartbeat of ships. Scientists now moor listening stations across whole oceans, tracking whales by voice, recording earthquakes, even hearing icebergs calve a hemisphere away. They have learned that the sea has grown noisier with engines, and that whales fall silent or change their songs to cope. Quiet ship design is becoming a kindness as well as a science. The old explorers charted what they could see. The newest ones chart what can be heard, mapping the ocean's voices, and discovering that the silent deep was never silent at all, only waiting, patiently, for someone to put an ear to the water. Drifting buoys by the thousands take the ocean's pulse every hour. Scattered across every sea, an international fleet of unmanned drifters rides the currents, reporting position, temperature, and pressure by satellite. Below them, thousands of diving floats sink to a kilometer's depth, drift for days, then descend further and rise to the surface, profiling the water column before phoning home and sinking again, repeating this gentle breathing for years. Together, they form the ocean's nervous system, feeding weather forecasts and climate models with the constant murmur of measurements. No crew, no sails, no drama, just patient instruments riding the world's currents, exactly as messages in bottles once did, but answering back daily. It is the old dream of the drift bottle, perfected. The currents themselves have become the expedition, and the ocean now participates, hourly and willingly, in its own description. Coral reefs were mapped by expeditions and explained by Darwin's long patience. Sailors feared and marveled at coral, invisible gardens that could tear a hull, rising sheer from fathomless water to within a foot of the surface. Cook's endeavor was nearly lost on the Great Barrier Reef and limped to shore with coral plugging the very hole it made. Darwin, pondering atolls from the Beagle, proposed that those perfect rings of reef were monuments to vanished islands, coral growing patiently upward as old volcanoes sank, keeping pace with subsidence over ages. Borings into atolls. A century later proved him right. Coral piled kilometers deep over drowned rock. Reefs are now mapped from space and tended by science, recognized as the ocean's richest neighborhoods. They remain what they were to the first navigators who wondered at them. Proof that small, soft lives, given time enough, can build something visible from the moon. The Galapagos taught expeditions that islands are laboratories, isolated islands. The stepping stones of every ocean crossing turned out to be more than waypoints. They were experiments running for millions of years. On the Galapagos, Darwin noticed tortoises differing island by island. On Hawaii, honeycreepers had radiated into dozens of forms. On each remote archipelago, castaway species had quietly invented new ways of living. Island life also proved fragile, vulnerable to the rats, goats, and appetites ships brought. And some of exploration's saddest chapters were written in extinctions. Modern expeditions return as guardians, restoring islands, removing invaders, watching species step back from the brink. The lesson the islands teach is now tended like a garden. Every speck of land in the ocean is a separate story the planet is telling itself, and we have finally learned to read without tearing the pages. Ocean crossings carried plants and foods that remade the world's tables. Expedition holds moved more than people. They carried cuttings, seeds, and tubers that rewrote agriculture on every shore. Potatoes and tomatoes crossed from the Americas and conquered Europe. Wheat, coffee, and citrus traveled the other way. Breadfruit was famously shipped across the Pacific in a floating greenhouse. Spices that once justified entire fleets, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, now sit casually in every kitchen. Each cuisine we call traditional is partly a souvenir of voyages. Italian food before the tomato, Ireland before the potato, Thailand before the chili would be unrecognizable to us. The great exchanges had their dark chapters too, and the sea roads carried sorrow as well as seeds. But every supper table on earth is quietly a harbor. The evening meal assembled from continents, delivered across centuries by ships. The age of sail's greatest skill was reading the sky. Without forecasts, a captain's barometer and his weather eye were the ship's whole meteorology. Sailors read mares' tails and mackerel skies, halos around the moon, the feel of swell arriving from storms still below the horizon. Red sky at night brought comfort. A falling glass sent men aloft to shorten sail before the gale declared itself. Cape pigeons gathering, dolphins racing the bow. A sudden oily calm. Everything meant something, and the lore was passed from watch to watch like a living almanac. Modern meteorology grew from this attention. Its first data, the pooled observations of thousands of patient hulls. Satellites see the storms now days away, but officers still step out to look at the sky before believing the screen, keeping faith with the oldest instrument aboard. A human being, watching weather, thinking. Marine chronometers had understudies, the humble, heroic deck watch. The precious chronometer never left its cushioned box below, so its time was carried up to the navigator by a deck watch, a sturdy pocket watch, compared against the chronometer before each round of sights. Officers logged the comparison to the second, tracking each timepiece's personality. this one gaining a beat daily, that one sulking in cold weather in a small ledger of mechanical temperaments. Expeditions carried dozens. The Beagle sailed with 22 chronometers to survey time around the globe. Watchmakers competed for naval contracts the way engine builders later would. And a good timekeeper's serial number was known and respected like a ship's name. Inside the grand story of navigation ticks this smaller, fonder one. Generations of sailors attending to little brass hearts, winding them gently every day, as if the whole wide ocean depended on it because it did. Naval expeditions measured the planet itself, swinging pendulums on lonely shores. Beyond charting coasts, the great surveying voyages carried out a stranger duty, measuring gravity. Landing parties set up delicate pendulum instruments on beaches from Spitsbergen to Australia, timing thousands of swings because the tiny variations from place to place revealed the true shape of the Earth. Slightly flattened, slightly uneven, more pear than sphere. Other parties hauled magnetometers ashore to map the planet's magnetic moods, on which every compass depended. It was exploration at its most patient. Weeks on a windswept island watching a weight swing back and forth for the sake of a decimal. Yet from such tedium came the figure of the Earth used for every chart and eventually every satellite orbit. The ocean expeditions did not just map the world. They weighed it, timed it, and took its magnetic pulse, politely beach by beach. The seafloor keeps history safe better than any museum. Cold, dark, and still, the deep ocean preserves what it takes. Ancient Greek ships rest with their wine jars stacked as loaded. The Mary Rose rose after 4 centuries with longbows and surgeon's tools intact. Franklin's lost ships, found at last beneath Arctic waters, sit nearly whole, plates still in their racks. From a Roman-era wreck, divers raised the Antikythera mechanism, a bronze-geared computer of the heavens 2,000 years old, the most surprising artifact antiquity ever surrendered. Marine archaeologists now glide over wrecks with cameras and gentle hands, reading each as a sealed letter from its century. Underwater museums and laws protect the oldest hulls where they lie. The ocean, so often history's destroyer, turns out to be its most careful librarian, keeping whole chapters of the human story in cold storage, awaiting readers with lights. We have better maps of the moon than of our own ocean floor still. The entire lunar surface is charted to a few meters. Mars is mapped in loving detail, yet most of Earth's seafloor is known only as a blur inferred from satellite gravity, like reading a face through frosted glass. Only about a quarter has been surveyed by direct sonar to modern standards. An international project named Seabed 2030 is patiently closing the gap, pooling data from research fleets, cargo ships, and even yachts. And every year, new mountains, canyons, and drowned landscapes emerge from the unknown into the known. Whole seamount, ranges taller than the Alps, await their first soundings. It is strangely comforting. In an age when every street is photographed, the majority of our own planet remains politely unexplored, patient as it has always been, holding its valleys in the dark for whoever sails next. Sailing to the horizon taught humanity the Earth was round long before photographs. Watch a departing ship from any shore, and it does not shrink to a dot. It sinks, hull first, then sails, then masthead, swallowed in order by the curve of the world. Ancient Greek thinkers cited exactly this as proof of the sphere, along with the round shadow Earth casts on the moon. Sailors lived the geometry daily, raising lighthouses tip first over the horizon and adjusting their navigation for the curvature with every sight. Eratosthenes measured the planet's circumference astonishingly well 2,000 years before anyone could see it whole. But it was mariners who kept the knowledge as common, working fact. When the Apollo crews finally photographed the blue marble, sailors might have nodded without surprise. The ocean's edge had been quietly telling everyone the shape of home all along. The sea was never flat to those who watched. Some expeditions sought not land, but the ocean's own breathing, the tides. For coastal peoples, the tides were the day's metronome, but their cause was a riddle for ages. Twice daily floods that followed the moon in some baffling way. Newton finally explained the pull. The patient charting fell to mariners and mathematicians who, port by port, recorded years of water heights and teased out each harbor's personality. Some seas barely breathe. The Bay of Fundy heaves 16 meters, emptying and refilling like a tilted basin. Lord Kelvin built brass tide-predicting machines, gears, and pulleys that calculated a year of tides in an afternoon, machines that served through 2 world wars. Today, the predictions live in every phone, but they rest on those long ledgers of watched water. The ocean rises tonight on schedule everywhere, and somewhere in that punctuality survives every harbor master who ever kept its diary. The loneliest job in exploration may have been the crow's nest. High on the foremast, in a canvas barrel or iron hoop, the lookout stood his watch above the world. 2 hours of scanning the circle of the sea for sails, spouts, breakers, or ice, in air that magnified every roll of the hull into a swoop. Whalers gave the post its name and its purpose, eyes that earned the ship her cargo. On polar voyages, the nest was hung with sheepskin against the cold. The lookouts cry, "Land ho, sail ho," ice on the starboard bow, was the heartbeat of every discovery narrative ever written. Radar pensioned off the post, though ships still keep human watch by law. But spare a thought, drifting towards sleep, for those high solitary figures, the first human beings by a few minutes, to see almost everything the age of expeditions ever found. Ship's surgeons stitched the world together with curiosity as well as thread. The naval surgeon of the sailing era was often the only man of science aboard, setting bones and lancing fevers, but also pressing plants, sketching jellyfish, and keeping weather journals between patients. Many great naturalists shipped as surgeons, Huxley among them, using the sickbay as a study. They fought scurvy with experiment, tested airs and diets, and their medical logs, preserved by navies, now serve historians of climate and disease alike. On polar expeditions, the doctor often doubled as photographer, zoologist, and morale officer, prescribing theatricals against the long night. Their quiet rounds rarely made headlines, yet every famous expedition stood on their work. The captain's name went on the cape, while below decks a man with cold hands and a notebook kept the crew alive to see it and wrote everything down. The albatross follows ships for days, and sailors made it a sacred companion. In the great southern ocean, where the westerlies circle the planet unbroken, the wandering albatross rides the wind on wings spanning 3 meters, gliding for hours without a single beat, sometimes following a vessel for days as if escorting it. Sailors held that the birds carried the souls of lost shipmates, and harming one invited the fate made famous in Coleridge's poem of the unlucky mariner. Science added its own wonder. Albatrosses sleep on the wing, circle the globe between breeding seasons, and live for over half a century, crossing more ocean in a lifetime than any sailor ever did. Expeditions now band and track them with reverence. They remain the deep sea's most faithful companions, appearing from empty sky in the loneliest latitudes settling into a ship's wake like an old habit, asking nothing. Antarctica was the last great landfall, sighted barely 2 centuries ago. While civilizations rose and fell, an entire continent waited unseen at the bottom of the world, wrapped in its ring of storm and ice. Not until 1820 did expeditions, Russian, British, and American, within months of one another, finally sight the white coast, and decades passed before anyone wintered ashore. The heroic age that followed wrote its sagas. Then, remarkably, the continent was given to peace. The Antarctic Treaty set it aside for science. The only continent never to have known war, where dozens of nations share stations and data beneath the aurora. Expeditions there now study ice cores holding 800,000 years of climate memory. The last land humanity ever found became the first it agreed to keep gently. The planet's great white library, visited on tiptoe and left as found. The ocean made the planet habitable, and expeditions taught us to thank it. Every second breath we take comes from the sea. Microscopic plants drifting in sunlit water produce around half the world's oxygen. The ocean stores and shuffles the sun's heat, feeds billions, and shapes every cloud. None of this was obvious. It took centuries of voyages, samples, and patient measurement to understand that the blue part of the map is the planet's working heart. Modern expeditions monitor that heart's health, its warming, its chemistry, its great currents, with the same care navies once gave to charting reefs. The relationship has matured. We no longer merely cross the ocean or take from it. We tend it. The oldest human partnership, people and salt water, has entered its gentlest chapter. And every research cruise that sails tonight is, in its way, a thank you note. The stars that guided the first canoes still hang over every ship tonight. Polaris still marks north within a degree. The Southern Cross still points the way for navigators below the equator. Orion still rises over the same sea roads Phoenician helmsmen watched. Star compasses memorized by Pacific wayfinders. The zenith stars that told Hawaiians their latitude. The lunar tables Cook carried. All refer to the same patient sky that satellites now share. Sailors are taught that in a total failure of electronics, the heavens remain fully operational, requiring only knowledge. There is deep comfort in that continuity. Civilizations, ships, and instruments have changed beyond recognition, but the night watch looks up at the identical ceiling. The sky is the one chart that has never needed correcting, hanging quietly over 5,000 years of wakes, waiting each evening for whoever still cares to read it. Every harbor at dusk repeats the oldest scene in seafaring. The day's last light slides over breakwaters. Lines are made fast. Gulls argue over the cleaning of the catch. Somewhere a mast light blinks on. A vessel home from sea settles against her fenders with small creaks, and the crew steps ashore with the particular happy clumsiness of legs remembering land. It has looked this way in Piraeus and Zanzibar, in Lisbon and Nantucket, for thousands of years. The safe arrival, the watch finally stood down. Most voyages in history were not famous expeditions, but exactly these. Fishermen and traders and ferrymen coming home at evening, the ocean's daily bread. All the grand stories rest on this gentle routine. Tonight in 10,000 harbors, it is happening again, quietly. The world's ships breathing out, lights coming on over calm water. Day's end, journey's end, rest. The sea remains the great teacher of patience. Everyone who has ever gone to sea reports the same change. The ocean resets the clock. Weather arrives when it arrives. The tide will not be argued with. A passage takes the time it takes. Sailors learn to wait well, to watch long, to do the next small right thing and trust the accumulation. Expeditions succeeded not by hurrying, but by enduring, wintering over, standing watches, mending and waiting and going on. The lesson survives every technology. Even now, a container ship simply cannot rush a gale, and a sailor's first virtue is still a calm temper. Perhaps that is the deepest cargo the expeditions brought home, quieter than spices or charts, the practiced human skill of patience itself, learned from the largest, oldest, most unhurried thing on earth, and available even tonight to anyone willing to breathe slowly. And still, after everything, the ocean keeps its oldest promise. There is more. Every coastline has been photographed from space, every route timed to the minute. And yet the sea remains the planet's standing invitation. New species surface in nets every month. Unmapped mountains wait in the dark. Currents shift and reveal. The deep trenches have been visited fewer times than some museum rooms. Children on every shore still stand where the water meets their feet and feel the same pull the first raft builders felt. The age of expeditions never ended because the ocean never finished being unknown. It rocks the buoys and the research ships tonight. It carries the whales and the cables and the last light of the lighthouses, patient as ever, generous as ever. And somewhere beyond the harbor lights, the horizon waits, as it always has, for morning and for whoever sails next. Tonight, we sailed together through the long story of ocean expeditions. We followed the first canoes out beyond the reef and steered with the Polynesian masters by swell and star. We rounded the great capes with the clippers, wound the chronometers, counted the knots slipping through patient fingers, and stood the night watch under slow constellations. We drifted with Shackleton's men on the groaning ice, dove into the glowing dark with the deep submersibles, and listened with the new quiet ships to whales singing across whole oceans. And through it all ran the same gentle thread, patience, attention, and the long human love of the horizon. There is nothing left now to navigate. When you are ready, another quiet journey will be waiting here for you, ready to carry you onward through another evening. If these calm hours help you rest, a soft follow helps other tired travelers find this harbor too. But for now, let the ship settle and the lines go slack. Let your breathing find the rhythm of still water. The lanterns are lit, the watch is kept, and the tide will manage everything without you. Rest well and sweet dreams.